Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thanks for being delighted to introduce me. I'm equally delighted to be here. I saw some familiar faces that I have traveled with a long time ago. Not sure when last we saw each other, Harriet. It's been a long time, but we first encountered each other about 25, 30 years ago. Gosh, let's not tell people how old we really are. And then Mehri, we used to think right next to you, also we met Bendorf about 20, 25 years ago. Sometimes I think it's wonderful that there are these struggles, these commitments, that one lives alongside, and that they refuse to leave one, despite oneself. Our commitment to understand the world, our commitment to create a new world, free from prejudices, misunderstandings. I, for example, grew up, yes, in the struggle against apartheid. But when I lived in Pakistan for 8 years. I was in a madrasa. Some of you who know anything, I mean, at least one or two of you that I chatted to earlier on come from the area in Karachi. Some of you will know this very famous madrasa, Jamia bin Nouriya, bin Nouri town, more famous for its anti-Shia polemics, later its anti-Maududi polemics. And regrettably, much later, became kind of the Yale or the Harvard of much of Muslim fundamentalism. And in the midst of all of this, come back to South Africa, see new terrains of struggle, see how the gender, the race discrimination that one lives under, how it is replicated in much of Muslim societies in the forms of gender discrimination, for example. And then moving on from there, struggling for a new South Africa, having the privilege to be a part of the destruction of the old, and the privilege of building the new, and then seeing how the victories of our democracy, of our freedom struggle is being usurped as the swath of illness, the HIV pandemic spreads across particularly sub-Saharan African. How now do you see new struggles? Struggles to resist the stigmatization of people living with sexually transmitted diseases. Huge. And so it's a struggle. We continue, we work, we get energized by it. And many of these causes don't leave us sometimes despite ourselves. So it's wonderful to see I'm sure in many of your own lives, veterans also of your own struggles. But I'm to talk to you tonight about this person, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. This person, Muhammad, may God's choicest blessings be on him and on his family. Of course, like all other Muslims, I've grown up with this man. Since my earliest memories, I've grown up with this man. It's not possible for me, as a Muslim, to have an objective opinion towards this man. Is it then just a blind love? Possibly it is. There is this person, Muhammad, that we believe, in the words of his wife, كَانَ خُلُقُهُ الْقُرْآنِ, that his character, his whole life, when she was asked about his life, this is what her response was, that his character, his whole persona was the Quran. It's this man that the Quran declares, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ, that in this messenger of God, there is the noblest of example. So from an early childhood, we grew up with this man that we believe was not only sent to us, but the Prophet was sent as وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ, that we have not sent you but as a source of grace, as a source of mercy unto the whole world. Others, of course, have seen him in a different light. All readings of persons like this are necessarily selective readings. Magdalene Robinson, for example, says about this person that nothing is certain about Muhammad's childhood. The void has gradually become filled with legends which grow even more beautiful and edifying with the passage of time. So there has been a considerable amount of critical, revisionist literature about the life of this man, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. You know, in some ways, when I think about the life of this man and how I struggle with this life in terms of how do I, as a Muslim who wants to live contemporaneously, live as a child of the age, live in fidelity to all the major crises that we find in the world. The crises of violence, the crises of occupations, of suffering, of dispossession, and of course, from my own, again, Southern African reality, the crises of death and dying by illness and disease on the one hand, and the crises of inequalities on the other, where death and life is dependent on whether you can afford health care or not. How do I live when in fidelity to this man? How do I live with this man in my life? How do I live with this man as a Muslim, as a struggler with all of these issues? I derive, I suspect like many of you, an enormous amount of inspiration from the life of this man. Occasionally, as a scholar, there are things, of course, that tugs at me. Hey, man, how do you explain this? And I don't really want to go into these issues, but I just want to mention two examples. For example, the Prophet's marriage at a very young age to Aisha Siddiq. It's a difficult one. The expulsion, thank you very much, the expulsion of the Jews from Medina, very difficult one if you know anything about Islamic history. It's a very awkward one. But on the whole, my living with this person, earlier on, it was Rafiq Abdullah who asked me if I knew Abdullah Ibrahim, also known as Dollar Brand, any of you who know anything about jazz. I don't know anything about jazz. I've been to an opera performance just once in my life. But I somehow think that my relationship to this man, Muhammad, on the one hand, and the tugs of critical scholarship on the other, goes something like this. You're sitting in an opera house, dressed for the occasion, know and feel something for music. It's an absolute exquisite performance in front of you. The ambience, the music, simply the best performance in front of you. The performance is in Italian. You don't quite speak Italian. And then there is somebody, you're sitting on the balcony, one of the best views that you can get. And then there is somebody that pulls at you and wants to tell you, do you know there is some text that doesn't quite fit in this opera. Let me give you the Italian real translation of this text. What the heck? Music moves me. Music is my life. Not really, it is just an analogy. Although I have just finished on the plane this wonderful book, Mao's Last Dance. Some of you may have read it, about this ballet performer in Mao Zedong's. Anyway, so this is how we relate to this man, Muhammad. Inspire moves us. As I said in the words of Khadija, his character, his personality was the Quran. I want to say something about the externals about the life of this man before I come to some of the more substantial things that I wanted to say. So for us, he was born and he lived out his mission in the broad daylight of history. The details of his life are encapsulated in this body of knowledge that we know as the Sirat al-Nabawi. This Sirah, of course, has acquired the status of sacred history. We can't just read music. We listen to music. We feel the music. The Quran itself does not provide much of a detail of the life of the Prophet. The most commonly accepted year of his birth into the Hashemite clan, it's 570. And his early childhood was quite a tragic one. His 25-year-old father, Abdullah ibn Abdul Muttalib, died on a trade journey a few months before he was born. His mother, 2 years after he was born. She had gone on a visit to the grave of her father near Medina. Muhammad accompanied his mother on this journey. She had introduced him to some of his relatives among the Khazraj. By now, he was already an orphan, very conscious of the memories of his dead father because of his visit to Yathrib. He was almost crushed by the loss of his mother. As a child, he became more and more withdrawn, sad, mild, and sensitive of disposition. Many years later, he stopped at the sight of his mother's grave and he wept bitterly. Asked by his companions about his weeping, he replied, "I was overwhelmed by my memories of her affection and I wept for her." Then, cared for by his grandfather. After 2 years, his grandfather passes away. Move on to his uncle. The tragic life of a tragic figure. Single motherhood, it's not easy. It's not easy today. Single motherhood particularly wasn't easy then. But it is the story of, in some ways, the broken child, passed from pillar to post. Muhammad's nurse recounted the day Abdul Muttalib passed away. "I saw the apostle of God, may bless him, weeping that day behind the bier of Abdul Muttalib." This adult, this man, not trapped in a sense of what it means to be a man. What is machoism? A man doesn't cry. This man is willing to cry. Cries for his mother, cries for his grandfather, cries at the memory of these people, but also at what they meant to him in his life. Later, when he became the recipient of divine revelation, God reminded him of his early days of loss, poverty, and bewilderment. "Alam yajidka yatiman fa'awa." Did he not find you an orphan and give you refuge? أَلَمْ يَجِدْكَ ضَالًّا فَهَدَى. Did he not find you lost and guided you? Did he not find you poor? Did he not find you poor and made you self-sufficient? As was common amongst the Arab tribes, when Muhammad was born, he was entrusted to what is known as a foster mother or a milk mother. The idea was that desert conditions make for healthier suckling. Muslim tradition holds that even in this early period, that Muhammad was going to have an extraordinary life. The son of Halima reported that two men came dressed in white, opened his breast, stirred their hands inside. Later he explained that these were angels who had washed a dark spot from his heart with snow. Referring to this and similar traditions, Montgomery Watt says that it's almost certain that they are not true in the realistic sense of the secular historian. For they purport to describe facts which we might have expected later on people to attribute to Muhammad's life. Yet they give you an idea of the significance of Muhammad for believing Muslims. And in that sense, they are true and a fitting prologue in the life of their prophet. But there was also another incident, and for me very significant, connected to the same Halima. It was common for women from the outlying areas to come to the city to look for children to suckle. And Halima and several other women had come from the outlying, from the deserts, not the outposts of Mecca. Mecca was really a small outpost at that time. And they didn't want to take Muhammad because at the back of their minds were that this man, that this child, he doesn't have a father. When we return him to his mother, how big will the size of the gift be that we get from her? Quite insignificant. So even as a child, Muhammad is at the receiving end. It was much later, after 2 or 3 days, when nobody else, they couldn't find another person, and then, what is this? A half a loaf, what is this? I'm confusing metaphors now. A half an egg is better than an empty shell. Is this an English metaphor? A halve eier is beter as 'n leë dop. Something is better than nothing. Point taken. What's that? A half a loaf is better than none. Yes, a half a loaf is better than none. So fine, they got stuck, with this boy, Muhammad. Of course, Muhammad, at the age of 8, moves then into the care of his uncle, Abu Talib, who rears Muhammad for many, many years until his adulthood. His teens, generally, one of the early historians, Ibn Sa'ad, reflects Muslim appreciation of his youth when he writes, God protected him and kept him safe from the practices of Jahiliyyah, pre-Islamic ignorance, for want of a better word at the moment, and its evils. He followed the faith of his people till he attained manhood. He proved to be the most excellent of them, best in disposition, most respected in society, sweet of tongue, most forbearing and trustworthy, most truthful in speech, remote from obscenity and teasing the people. He was never noticed quarreling or suspecting anyone. Thus, the community gave him the appellation of Al-Amin. It was because God had united virtuous deeds in him that he was mostly known as Al-Amin, the trustworthy at Mecca. So here is this young man, works with his uncle as a bit of a shepherd, later on accompanies his uncle as a bit of an assistant on trade journeys up north. Works for this woman called Khadija, and at the age of 25, 26, Khadija, a widower of 40 years old, proposes to Muhammad. They became the parents of 2 sons. And both of these 2 children died when they were very small in infancy. And they had 4 daughters. This man, Muhammad, in a strongly patriarchal society, on the whole, much of the world is still patriarchal. The Middle East particularly, and some parts of Africa particularly. In many of those societies, you're not a man until you haven't produced a child. You're not a real man until you haven't produced a son. Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam just manages to make it to be a real man in society terms and there. The boys are gone when they are children. Never saw any kind of childhood even. Later on, of course, the Quran turns this whole abtar progeny list, offspring list, turns it on its head and talks about how real life is about your deeds, how those who are with progeny are those who don't leave any righteous deeds behind. Deeply, deeply happy as a married person, he remained deeply troubled. He found the idolatry and the fetishism of the neighborhood of Hijaz vulgar, and he found many of the social injustices deeply distressing. And then he begins increasingly to search for a response to his own agony, his own pain at witnessing all the injustices around him. Becomes quiet, becomes withdrawn, increasingly goes onto mountain retreats. The quest for his soul was for explanation and truth, and the longing of his heart was for communion with the true God. This true God whose nature, the nature of whom he did not know. It was then in 610 when Muhammad, then aged about 40 years old, first hears this voice, when revelation first dawns upon him. The Quran speaks about this revelation to a Nabi al-Ummi. There's lots of different things about Ummi, the meaning of Ummi. One of 2 meanings. This Gentile prophet, this non-Jewish prophet, in an area where on the whole, the prophets had all come from the Jewish community, for want of a better word at the moment. This non-Jewish prophet comes, Nabi al-Ummi. Oh, this Nabi al-Ummi, this Muhammad, who's not incapable of writing, this illiterate prophet. And this word speaks to this man. What is Muhammad's first response after his encounter with Gabriel? Terrified, petrified, runs home. Who does he run to? He runs to his wife. Muhammad, the vulnerable prophet. Muhammad, the broken person. You know, often, and I'll come back to this, we're living through a time where vulnerability is something that belongs to weak people. The need to cry, the need to be embraced and to express that, it's something that belongs to weak people. We're living through a time when it appears as if the only Islam that we can present to the world is a strong Islam, where heroes are strong people. Our hero is a vulnerable person. Our hero counts for nothing because he was passed from pillar to post as a child. Our hero counts for nothing because he doesn't have boys. Our hero is such a weakling that he runs to a woman and he tells this woman, Zammiluni, Zammiluni, cover me up, cover me up. And so Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam trembles, rushes off to his wife, who covers him and who consoles him. But this restlessness that moved him to the cave of Hira, this restlessness is not a restlessness that is allayed simply with revelation. No, the restlessness continued. In fact, shortly after that, for a long while, this continued, the intermission in the period of revelation. When the Prophet really thought that there is something seriously wrong with him, that God has abandoned him. But even then, in all of this restlessness, there was a desperation to reach closeness to God. It was then the social injustices, the poverty, the discrimination, the hurt against many of the foreigners who were from lesser communities, the black slaves in Mecca, that first drove Muhammad in search of what does God have to say to all of this. It is this God who speaks. It is this God that he remains in yearning for all of his life, but never without a commitment to also transforming his context. And so it's an eternal God that speaks from an eternity, but a God who speaks into a real context. Kenneth Cragg, are you still as much a fan of Kenneth Cragg as you were years ago, Hattie? Yes? Kenneth Cragg speaks about this in this way. The messenger has a locale, a circumstance, a context, and a history. The language is Arabic, and the local setting is that of a commercial metropolis and a pilgrim's shrine. The vocabulary reflects a range of influences and associations already current within that society. Whatever enters into time comes from wherever. It must necessarily come at a given time. Nor can an apostleship in God's name be other than into a year and a now. And so when I look at the life of this man, Muhammad, I am compelled to look at this man's life from where I am. I am a child of my age. I am a child of my context. I cannot escape my context. So sometimes when we talk about, the universality of the Quran or the universality of the Prophet's message, we don't often take cognizance about how, yes, that at many levels, this message is universal, but there are also many specifics to that message that related to a specific context. So Muhammad remains sure at all times that yes, La ilaha, that this is what he is meant to proclaim. La ilaha illallah, that there is no God but God. Absolute certainty that there is none but God. Absolute certainty that he was sent by God as a messenger into this world. There is a faith in himself. He declares, Ana Rasulullah, I'm the messenger of God, but the messenger of God. So there's a faith in himself and a faith in the beyond. Self-confidence but also that it's not about him. Firm in his proclamation about his new faith, and Bashira wa Nadhira, I'm coming to give you glad tidings that if you change your lives, that God is with you, what kind of a life awaits you, wa Nadhira, and a warner. Sometimes, in contemporary discourse, we often think that the prophetic task is only about giving glad tidings. The prophetic task is also about warning. If, for example, you look at the recent conference on global warming, warnings, global warming, but warnings to humankind. If you don't change your ways, this is what will happen. Sometimes also in this slogan, no justice, no peace. It's not simply a statement, it's not just a threat. It's also that no, societies that are characterized by injustice will never have a genuine kind of peace. And so this man comes, Bashira wa Nadhira, he comes as a bearer of glad tidings, and he comes as a warner. All of the self-confidence, but it's not in him. Inna salati wa nusuki wa mahyaya wa mamati lillahi rabbil alamin. That my prayers and my life and my sacrifice, it is for God. For God who is lillahi rabbil alamin, who is the Lord of the universes. So the quest, the search, then, it's an ongoing search, but it's a search for the beyond. It's a search for the transcendent. This Allah, that he comes to proclaim, La ilaha, that there is no deity illallah. This God in many ways remains elusive. This God in many ways remains unfathomable. This God is Akbar, not the greatest, but greater than. You want to trap him one moment into your dogma, God eludes it. You want to catch God, turn him into a cricket fan, because the Pakistanis are playing the Indians tomorrow, and so, Allah say, God, get some help from God, dua karo yaar, jitna chahiye, Hindu log, So you capture God. You're going into war tomorrow, you have all your invading forces lined up, whether it is against Afghanistan or now getting ready for Iran or whatever, and you call, what was his name, Jimmy Swaggart, gets called into the White House to pray because our troops are going. And so you wrap your God into your British flag, into your American flag, into your Shi'i flag, into your Sunni flag, and you reduce your God to a simple cricket fan, or to a simple American or a simple Brit. This Allah that Muhammad calls people to is Akbar. This God is greater than. This God is greater than all our dogmatic, our doctrinal formulations of God. This God is never the prisoner of a community. This God becomes ours, all of ours, but not created in our imagination. The Quran, in fact, is remarkably silent on issues of dogma and doctrine. And this is the God that Muhammad tries to understand. I'll say something more about this later. So, this Allah who is Akbar transcends then dogmatic, doctrinal boundaries, is always bigger than this new community that is being formed. Claims to be a part of a universal community. Nothing unique about his mission. that no, this was the same message that had come to you before, and all, whether it was Ibrahim and Musa and Isa and this Muhammad, I'm just one of all of these prophets who were sent by God. I share in this universal community of truth. يا أيها الرسل كلوا من طيبات واعملوا صالحات واعلموا أن هذه أمتكم أمة واحدة. O prophets, eat of the good and do good, and know that this ummah of yours is a single ummah. Now, ummah, today, you know, when Muslims look at ummah, yeah, God speaks to all the prophets, Ya ayyuha rusul, O prophets. And this people of yours, it is a single people. So the message is located in universal one, the shared identity. No, the Quran mocks the exclusivism of other communities. For example, but it's amazing how this very mocking of exclusivism we turn upside down and we use it as weapons against other communities instead of learning the message of inclusivism in it. For example, ما كان إبراهيم يهوديا ولا نصرانيا بل كان حنيفا مسلما. That Abraham was not a Christian, but neither was he a Jew, but he was a Hanif, he was upright. بل كان حنيفا مسلما, but he was a Hanif and a Muslim. Wait, is God saying, wait, he wasn't a Christian, he wasn't one of you, he wasn't one of you, he's one of us? Is God buying into the narrowness of what Muslims have come to understand by the term Muslims? I'm talking about Muslims in the sociological sense of the word. No. God says Ibrahim kana hanifa musliman. He was upright and someone submitting or struggling to submit to the will of God. But we, post-revelation, after this Islam, the prophetic path of struggling to submit to the will of God, we package it into our boxes, into our community boxes, and then we drag this universal figure, who was an ummah in himself, Abraham, we drag this universal figure, reduce him completely to size, put him into our box, walk away with the box like a child, you know, it's my ball, and you walk away. Can't, no. Abraham wasn't one of you. Abraham wasn't one of you. He was one of us. This ummah is described in the Quran as an ummatan wasatan, as an ummah of the medium path. But the Quran also speaks about Jews and Christians as ummatan muqtasida, balanced communities. The Quran speaks about the Christian community as ummatan qa'ima. Now look, there are many theological arguments to much of this and so on. Some of these arguments I've unraveled in some of my other works and so on. Are the books here? Yes, some of these books are on sale. I mean, in particular in this book of mine, Quran, Liberation and Pluralism, I've really looked at some of this, the theological dimensions to some of these texts around Jews and Christians in the Quran. So yes, the Quran is not an unmitigated book of just niceness. There are awkward ones that I've tried to argue are really very, very contextual. There is, for example, the saga, as I mentioned earlier on, of the Jews in Medina. But there's also the case of a Jewish woman from Khaybar who brought the Prophet poisoned meat which he tasted but did not swallow when he realized that it had been poisoned. Muhammad's companion Bishr swallowed a morsel of the deadly meat. fell grievously ill and he died soon thereafter. The woman was apprehended and brought to the Prophet, who asked her why she had carried out this criminal act. When she replied that she had done it to avenge the defeat of her tribe, she was pardoned. We have Muhammad, who enters Mecca after years and years of persecution, some of the most unspeakable crimes committed against the early Muslims, and then just says, "Why shall I not forgive them as Joseph had forgiven his brothers?" There were no acts of reprisal that took place. On the contrary, his clemency towards those who had earlier shown implacable hostility towards him or his family is frequently recounted in literature. "There shall be no reproach this day. May God forgive you, for he is the most merciful of those who show mercy." So yes, Muhammad is the Uswatun Hasana. He's the most perfect of examples. The most perfect examples of what he did, but also the most perfect examples of how to be in the world. Was he error-prone? Yes, Muhammad made it clear that he can also make mistakes. There is, for example, from a very simple things, the case of the date palm. When he entered Medina and he didn't like the way people were matching their trees and so on, and the next year the trees did not blossom, and then He says, "No, sorry, I'm only human. If you're asked to do something concerning religion, accept it. But if you ask me on the basis of my personal opinion, then remember, I'm only a human." This humanness of this man gets irked. Abasa wa tawalla an ja'ahu al-a'ma, that he frowned and he turned away when this blind man came to him. And the Quran records the Prophet being reprimanded by it. Now, of course, in Muslim literature, we speak about this man, Muhammad, as the perfect human being. This is not a title that the Prophet would ever have claimed for himself. Muhammad knew who he was, but I'm quite sure that the Prophet would have thought that perfection, in all its senses, it's only a struggle towards it. There is never something called the perfect, but for us, yes. Muhammad was somebody, from his early age, lived on the edges. He was willing to court doubt and uncertainty in his quest for the transcendent. A transcendent who was always the transcendent. The transcendent, always just something that can't be grasped. When we today offer the example of the Prophet ﷺ as an example to the world, it's not as an example who has all the answers. The Quran speaks of itself as تِبْيَانًا لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ, an elaboration of everything. But the whole idea that we have all the answers to everything, human beings aren't intended to have all the answers to everything. It is inconsistent with the idea of the transcendent in the world today. So yes, this is an ummah that is connected to this man. This is an ummah that is in search of the transcendent. The Quran affirms the centrality of a believer, of God in a believer's life. The Quran does not affirm the centrality of a system to God. Any system, whether you want to call this the Islamic system or the Islamic state, the journeying of human beings is a journey towards God. And so it is to God that we owe this allegiance, this divine unity. Normally, we understand Tawheed in relation to God's absolute unicity. Many of us also understand that this Tawheed that Muhammad called people to is also a call for the unicity in humankind, the unicity of all of creation, our connectedness to our home, our connectedness to other species. A belief in the unity of God can only become meaningful if we display a concern for the way in which this unity of God is being damaged by racism, by sexism, by how we consume the resources of the world. And so we acknowledge that the entire creation is a reflection of God's presence, and we believe that God is beyond what we ascribe unto him. This God, as I said, is Akbar. If God is Akbar, then every expression of Islam and its law must be subjected to continuous revision and critique. This God is Rabb al-Nas, the Rabb of humankind, a Lord that brings into being and nurtures until perfection. This God is compassionate and gracious and has prescribed mercy upon himself. This God that Muhammad called people towards is not a lawyer, nor is he a politician. On the contrary, we get the impressions of a being who is concerned with taking society from one point, and he wants to take them further along the path of self-actualization and the recognition of God's all-pervading grace. You know, the Quran instructs the Prophet, فَعْبُدْ رَبَّكَ حَتَّى أَتَاكَ الْيَقِينَ, to worship and serve your God until certainty comes to you. What does it mean? This means that you serve God until the last moment of your life. But it also means, despite our embrace of certainty, despite our belief, absolute certainty, this unshakable, indomitable certainty belongs to another realm. It's not something for this world. I only want to say this in conclusion, friends, that the whole idea that we can't live with Iman, that we can't live with faith, at the same time, while we embrace tentativeness, questions is a condition of faith. Questions doesn't die with faith. The Quran at all times talk about this book is لِأُولِي الْأَبْصَارِ, for people of insight, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَفَكَّرُونَ, that you may try to comprehend, that you may understand. Understanding is not something that just happens now and now I understand. When we claim certainty, particularly for ourselves, particularly certainty in relation to others, this is the path of fundamentalism. This is the path where you walk over people, where you destroy bodies in the name of establishing your truths. There is a truth. There is an absolute truth that exists. But that truth does not belong to me and you. That truth, each one of us can only struggle towards. وَإِلَى اللَّهِ تُرْجَعُ الْأُمُورِ, and towards God all affairs move towards. Thank you very much, and God bless you all.